Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Produce Safety webinar series. My name is Erin DiCaprio. I'm an Associate Professor of Cooperative Extension and Community Food Safety and based in the Food Science and Technology Department at UC Davis. And I am one of several members of our UC Cooperative Extension Small Farms Produce Safety team. And so we welcome you here today to the third webinar in our series, which is focused on the CDFA produce safety rule inspection process and what to expect and how to prepare for a produce safety rule inspection. So thank you all for being here today, and we're really pleased to welcome our speaker for today's webinar, Angela Terrazas, who is a senior environmental scientist and produce safety rule and outreach specialist at the CDFA's Produce Safety Program, where she leads the education and outreach initiatives to enhance produce safety practices and compliance with the Food Safety Modernization Act produce safety rule across the state of California. Her background includes a master's in food safety from Michigan State University and a bachelor's in science, in food science from UC Davis, along with over a decade of food safety, quality, and regulatory experience, spanning multiple industries, including agriculture, manufacturing, food service, and retail. Her work has been recognized with several industry awards, and her career continues to reflect a deep commitment to enhancing food safety practices to provide a safe food supply chain for all consumers. So we welcome Angela to our webinar here today. So what Angela will cover during today's webinar is outlined here on this slide. She'll go over what to expect during a routine Food Safety Modernization Act produce safety rule inspection, tips on how to prepare for an inspection, and how the CDFA's produce safety program handles the post-inspection process. Since we are in a Zoom webinar here today, we ask that you enter any questions you have for Angela or the UC Small Farm Food Safety team in the Q&A box as Angela goes through her presentation, and we will address all those questions at the end of today's presentation. So be active, engaged in that Q&A. This is a really safe space for you all to ask any questions you have about the FSMA produce safety rule inspection process here in California. Getting ahead of myself. I wanted to point everyone as well to our UC team's website. The URL is here. So on this website, you can find numerous produce safety related resources. You'll also see information and registration links for our upcoming FSMA Produce Safety Alliance grower training courses. So if you're familiar with the FSMA Produce Safety Rule, you're probably also familiar with the requirement that you receive a certificate from that PSA grower training course. So our team offers those trainings every 2 weeks for growers both within California and across the US. So if you just open your web browser and type in UC Small Farm Food Safety, our website should come up in that search and you can easily find us. I also bring up our website because after today's webinar, we will be posting a list of resources related to the topic areas that Angela is going to be covering for us, as well as a recording for today's webinar. So you can always go back and review the information that Angela has shared in the future. We also have postings from our previously hosted webinars. If you want to go back and look at those recordings or any of the resources related to those topic areas, those are also housed on our team's website. So again, you can just search UC Small Farm Food Safety and you should be able to go right to that website that has, again, just numerous resources all related to produce safety. So with that, I want to hold as much time as we can for Angela. So I'm going to turn the webinar over to her.
Share my screen. Hopefully you guys can see it. All right, I'm getting some head nods, so I'll take that as a yes. Thank you so much, Erin, and thank you to the UCANR team for inviting me to speak today about FSMA produce safety rule inspections conducted by CDFA in the state of California. In today's presentation, we will be going over what to expect throughout the inspection process and tips on how you can best prepare for your future produce safety rule inspections. So for today's agenda, I'll first introduce the CDFA Produce Safety Program for those that may not be as familiar with us and the different resources that we offer. We'll also discuss on a high level who is impacted by the FSMA Produce Safety Rule, also called the PSR, so you can determine if you are or are not subject to these inspections. We'll then talk about what a FSMA Produce Safety Rule inspection is, including what that process looks like before, during, and after the actual inspection date. I'll also go over how to prepare for a PSR inspection, including tips that can help you throughout the process. And then lastly, we will round out our session today with a Q&A. So the CDFA Produce Safety Program is a unit housed within the CDFA Inspection Services branch, with the goal of ensuring that California produce farms are meeting the produce safety standards of the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA Produce Safety Rule, and that California produce farmers, growers, and handlers understand how to comply with these regulatory requirements. The FSMA Produce Safety Rule is a set of minimum federal food safety standards that apply to the growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of fresh produce. And these federal regulations are governed by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, or FDA. In the U.S., the FDA partners with each state's agricultural department or agency to collaboratively implement and regulate the FSMA Produce Safety Rule within each respective state. So in California, FDA partners with CDFA, specifically our program, the CDFA Produce Safety Program, to oversee the education, implementation, and regulation of the Produce Safety Rule. At the CDFA Produce Safety Program, we really focus on providing resources, educational materials, and trainings, and we strive to help California produce farmers, growers, and handlers understand what the regulatory requirements are to ultimately help improve food safety practices on the farm, as well as prepare for inspections. We'll then verify that the food safety practices are being properly met through regulatory inspections on the actual farm or produce operation. At CDFA, we offer a variety of free, no-cost resources for all California produce farmers, growers, and handlers, including free Produce Safety Alliance or PSA grower training courses, on-farm readiness reviews, also known as OFRRs, and the CDFA Technical Assistance Program. So under the Produce Safety Rule, there is a requirement that at least one supervisor or responsible party for your farm has completed a food safety training under a standardized curriculum that is recognized as adequate by FDA. And currently, the PSA grower training is the officially recognized training course by FDA. So if you have not yet completed this training, you definitely want to do so and obtain your certificate demonstrating that you have completed the training. The certificate is also something that we would ask for during a regulatory inspection. CDFA offers these courses for free throughout the year, and we also partner with the awesome folks here at the UC team to offer low-cost training courses. On-farm readiness reviews, or OFRRs, are another free service that we offer for Californians. And OFRRs are educational visits that you can request to take place on your farm or your operation prior to your first official regulatory inspection. OFRRs are essentially like a practice run of an inspection where a CDFA team member will come on site to help review the different PSR requirements and records that apply to your farm and conduct a farm walkaround to help identify any potential gaps and opportunities to enhance food safety practices to help you prepare for your first official inspection. It's a really great resource to take advantage of if you have not yet undergone your first inspection, because you'll have an opportunity to really deep dive into the PSR requirements and get hands-on support during your preparation process directly from CDFA. And then we also have the CDFA Technical Assistance Program. And this is a free service that connects you with a University of California Extension specialist for no cost, one-on-one consultative services and technical assistance. The UC specialists are available to help answer your produce safety related questions, ranging from compliance support on the produce safety rule to helping you prepare a farm food safety plan and your records. If you're interested in participating in the CDFA TAP program, feel free to reach out to us at the CDFA Produce Safety Program or the UC team members joining us here today. So as you can see, there's a lot of great free resources available to you. So don't be shy. Feel free to reach out to us anytime, and we'll be happy to help you prepare for PSR compliance and your regulatory inspection as well. To learn more about the CDFA Produce Safety Program, you're welcome to visit our website at cdfa.ca.gov/produce safety. And on our website, we house general information about our program, different resources, and a blog where we post regular updates on regulatory news, program updates, and training. You can also sign up for a mailing list through our website to get email notifications as well. And you can also email us or call us if you have any produce safety related questions. So feel free to reach out anytime. We're here to help. And last year, we also launched a new website called the Produce Safety Program Portal, or PSP Portal. And this portal allows you to access, view, and update your own farm account online at your convenience and have on-demand access to your digital produce safety inspection records for your own farms and operations. Your inspection records will be uploaded into your farm account after your inspection is completed, and you'll be able to respond to inspection-related action items directly through this portal. You can also communicate directly with our staff members if you have any questions as well, directly through this website. So now that we've talked about who we are at the CDFA Produce Safety Program, let's talk about who is impacted by the FSMA Produce Safety Rule on a high level. So the PSR applies to farms that grow, harvest, pack, or hold produce. And we call these 4 activities covered activities because they're activities that are covered under the Produce Safety Rule. And generally, farms that make over $25,000 in average annual produce sales over a 3-year rolling basis adjusted for inflation fall under the oversight of the PSR. And when we're talking about produce, we're specifically talking about raw agricultural commodities, which are fresh produce in its whole, natural, and unprocessed state. Raw agricultural commodities would not include any produce that has been manufactured or processed, for example, slicing, dicing, chopping, or freezing. Once you apply processing steps like these, that product will fall under a different set of regulations called the Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule, which is also a part of FSMA. Examples of produce under the PSR includes fresh fruits, vegetables, tree nuts, peanuts, mushrooms, herbs, and sprouts. So there are a few conditions and exemptions that a farm can have that could exempt them from the produce safety rule. So starting at that top left box in orange, if you're only growing produce that's considered to be rarely consumed raw, you could be considered to be not covered under the produce safety rule. FDA has defined a specific list of produce commodities that they have determined through a national survey to be considered typically cooked prior to consumption and not typically eaten raw. Potatoes, sweet corn, winter squash would be examples of produce that is rarely consumed raw. And if you're only growing rarely consumed raw commodities, then you would be considered to be not covered under the produce safety rule. Next, if you are making less than $25,000 in average annual produce sales over a 3-year rolling basis, adjusted for inflation, you are considered also to not be covered under the produce safety rule. And if you're only growing produce for personal consumption, so you're not selling any of your produce or making any produce sales, you would also not be covered under the PSR. And then there are 2 additional exemptions that are in place that are listed on the bottom row here. One is what's called a qualified exemption. So if you are making less than $500,000 in average annual food sales over a 3-year rolling basis adjusted for inflation, And the majority of the produce you sell is to a qualified end user. So, for example, directly to the consumer, a local retailer or restaurant that is either located only within the state of California or no more than 275 miles from your farm could be considered as qualified exempt. There is still some paperwork required. For example, you must demonstrate through actual records that you meet the food sales threshold and that the majority percentage of your produce is to qualified end users. And you must display your farm name and address conspicuously at the point of sale. Another exemption is what we call the commercial processing exemption. So if you know that all of your produce is going to undergo a kill step, so it's going through a validated processing step that is going to destroy pathogens of public health concern, then you could have a exemption as well. With the commercial processing exemption, you will need to demonstrate through documentation that 100% of your produce will undergo a commercial processing or kill step. And you will also need to disclose in your documents that accompany your produce with a statement that says the food is not processed to adequately reduce the presence of microorganisms of public health significance. So we talked about who the produce safety rule applies to. So if you're not covered or if you have an exemption in place, you will not need to undergo a produce safety rule inspection. But keep in mind, you will still need to maintain documentation to demonstrate that you are not covered or that you have a valid exemption in place. But if none of those apply to you, you will need to undergo a FSMA Produce Safety Rule inspection or PSR inspection. So what is a PSR inspection? This is a mandatory regulatory inspection that's conducted by credentialed FDA or state inspectors. During the inspection, we are evaluating the farm's compliance with the minimum federal produce safety standards of the FSMA Produce Safety Rule. Ultimately, the goal of an inspection is to help prevent foodborne illness and to improve public health by physically being on the farm, seeing the food safety practices in place, and then making sure that the different food safety requirements of the FSMA Produce Safety Rule are being met. So under the produce safety rule, the key areas of focus are going to be on those top potential sources of contamination where pathogens can come from and spread onto produce. So key areas of focus under the produce safety rule and during an inspection will be on humans. So you, your workers and visitors, and your health, hygiene, and illness management and training practices. Soil amendments, especially if they're derived from animal products and inputs. The animals themselves, since we know they can be carriers of pathogens like birds and salmonella, cows and E. coli. Buildings, equipment, and tools are also another area of focus, making sure that the places we're storing our produce, and particularly the food contact surfaces that are going to be directly touching our produce, is clean and sanitary. And last, but certainly not least, water. We use water throughout so many different touch points in the produce production process. So it's important that we make sure that the water that we use is safe, sanitary, and is not going to be a source of contamination. So what does a PSR inspection process look like? Well, let's go through the general flow of the process. First, you'll be directly contacted to schedule an inspection, typically through a phone call. If we determine that you are covered under the produce safety rule, we'll schedule an inspection date and confirm the logistics via email. We'll then come on site on the scheduled inspection date to observe your farm operations and review your records, which is typically about a day, but this could vary based on each operation. Then we'll work with you throughout the post-inspection process. So on the next few slides, I'll go over into more detail on these specific stages. So at the start of the inspection process, you will be contacted typically through a phone call from a CDFA representative. We'll have a discussion with you to confirm your general farm information and ask some questions to verify that you're actually covered by the produce safety rule. And examples of questions would include what type of produce you grow, your farm size, which under the PSR is based on your average annual produce sales over a 3-year rolling basis adjusted for inflation. You're going to hear that phrase a lot. And if any exemptions apply to your farm. If you're covered under the produce safety rule, Your inspection will be scheduled and the inspection confirmation details will be sent to you in writing via email. If you're not covered under the produce safety rule, you will not undergo an inspection at the time of the call, and your PSB portal farm account will be updated. Please note though, you may be called periodically in the future to re-verify your information since we know farm conditions are dynamic and can change over time. There are also additional ways you can submit and verify your current information, like through our farmer questionnaire, which is available on the homepage of our CDFA Produce Safety Program website, or directly through your farm account in the PSV portal. Once your inspection date is scheduled, we'll go ahead and start the day by meeting at our agreed upon starting location. Your CDFA inspector will kick off with an introduction meeting where they'll show you their regulatory credentials, confirming who they are, and they'll also provide you with a paper copy of the FDA Form 482 to officially start the inspection. The Form 482 is considered to be an official notice of inspection. It's essentially like a receipt that the inspection actually took place on your farm or your business operation on that particular date and time. Throughout the inspection, your inspector will review your records that are required under the produce safety rule and conduct a farm walk around to observe your covered activities like harvesting and packing, for example, and the sanitary conditions of your produce, food contact surfaces, and the areas where these items are stored and where covered activities would take place. Examples of areas visited during your inspection could be ranches, packing houses, coolers, water sources like your wells or reservoirs, and storage and cleaning areas for your equipment and packing materials. Essentially, you want to be prepared to walk your inspector through your product process flow during the walk around portion. And if there are any observations, your inspector will let you know as they observe them, and you will discuss potential corrective actions to address them. At the end of the inspection, there will be a closing meeting where your inspector will recap the observations seen during the inspection and provide you details on next steps. A hard copy of an FDA Form 4056 will be issued at the end that will capture any significant observations and findings that were observed during the inspection. And a few weeks after the close of the inspection, you'll be issued what's called a Produce Farm Inspection Report, or PFIR. And this is going to be emailed from a CDFA Produce Safety Program staff member. The PFIR is a state-issued report in a PDF format that captures your general farm information, a summary of your inspection, and any observations that were observed during your inspection. In the email, you will also be provided information on how to access your account in the PSB portal. And in the PSB portal, you can view your farm information, your inspection history, so all the inspections that ever took place at your farm. You can access the digital versions of your FDA Form 482, 4056 documents, and your PFIR. You can also directly upload any corrective actions if you're required to do so into your PSB portal. So let's talk about when a PSR inspection occurs. So all covered farms under the produce safety rule are going to receive an initial inspection, also known as your first inspection. The order in which farms are selected for an inspection is on a risk-based randomized sampling approach. And in California, it's approximated there's over 20,000 covered farms. So we are working through this list. So if you have not undergone your first inspection yet, don't be surprised if you get a call from CDFA. And as far as follow-up inspections go, you can anticipate to receive a routine inspection maybe every couple of years. If there were significant food safety findings observed during your inspection, or if there was a food safety incident related to your farm, the follow-up inspection could happen sooner. So it really depends on each farm and the food safety risk factors on how often a follow-up inspection will occur again on your farm or your operation. All right, so how do you prepare for a PSR inspection? Well, first, a great starting point is to take that PSA grower training course. Again, one supervisor or responsible party from each farm needs to have undergone the FDA standardized curriculum, which is currently the PSA grower training course. So if you haven't completed this yet, go ahead and take this course. It's really going to help set you up for success and give you that foundational knowledge on what you need to do to meet the FSMA PSR requirement. And then after you take the PSA course, you want to take a look at your food safety practices. Evaluate if you're meeting all the requirements of the produce safety rule that apply to your farm. Review your records, establish any new practices, or update records as needed to ensure compliance. And then throughout this phase, you don't have to go through it alone. We have those free services available to you, including OFRRs and the CDFA Technical Assistance Program to help you throughout this process. And then once everything's set up, just be ready to get contacted from CDFA to schedule your produce safety rule inspection. Okay, so now let's go over the specific requirements and records required under the FSMA produce safety rule. But keep in mind, this is going to be at a very high level as we only have about an hour or so together today. So definitely take that PSA grower training course if you want to go into greater detail on any of these topics. And then as we discuss the PSR requirements, I'll be dividing the topics on the key areas of focus under the produce safety rule, where pathogens can come from and spread to potentially contaminate produce. And each of these focus areas have their own set of requirements to be aware of. So let's first talk about the requirements for your workers and worker training. Under the produce safety rule, all personnel, including yourself and your workers, who will be handling and directly contacting your produce or food contact surfaces, must be trained upon hire at least once annually and as needed, including when training gaps occur. An example of a training gap would be if one of your harvest workers went to the restroom and you saw that they didn't wash their hands afterwards prior to resuming their harvesting duties. Hand washing is a requirement under the produce safety rule, and you're required to wash your hands anytime your hands are contaminated, including after you use the restroom. So that would be an example of a training gap where you'd want to make sure it gets addressed and ensure they know what your food safety policies are. In your training program, there are specific topics that are required under the FSMA produce safety rule. So you'll need to cover the principles of food hygiene and food safety, the importance of health and personal hygiene, including handling illnesses, and the specific parts of the PSR that would apply to their role. For example, if you have someone in charge of composting and managing soil amendments, you'd want to make sure that they're trained and knowledgeable of what the soil amendment requirements of the PSR are, since that's what they're going to be responsible for in their day-to-day job duties. In addition, for harvesting personnel, there are some additional training topics that you will need to cover, including recognizing contaminated produce that must not be harvested, and knowing how to inspect and correct issues with harvest containers, equipment, and tools for signs of contamination. For example, for your produce, if they're harvesting oranges, you'd want to make sure that they're trained not to harvest oranges with visible bird poop on it, and not harvest oranges that have been dropped to the ground. For harvest containers, equipment, and tools, your workers should know how to inspect them prior to use, and if it's not clean or safe to use, either swap it out, correct the issue, or notify a supervisor to help them obtain the clean materials that they need. For the supervisor requirement, you need to identify who in your farm is going to be your designated supervisor that's going to help oversee compliance to the PSR requirements. And that supervisor will need to undergo an FDA-recognized training curriculum, which at this time is the PSA Grower Training course. So when it comes to the required records, you want to make sure you have that PSA Grower Training certificate for your supervisor available for review during your inspection. And also have your worker training records and the materials that you trained them on ready for review as well. Your worker training records need to include the date and time the training occurred, the topics that you covered. So sometimes if people use handouts, presentations, they also include that with their training records so that we can see what topics you're covering. And then you also want to include the people that you trained as well as the subpart O requirements. So subpart O under the produce safety rule are general record keeping formatting requirements that apply to all records under the produce safety rule. I'm going to cover what those subpart O requirements are at the end of the presentation, since these requirements apply to all records. All right, so we covered the worker training requirements. Next, let's talk about soil amendments. So the types of soil amendments that the produce safety rule is focused on are biological soil amendments of animal origin, or BASAOs. BASAOs are soil amendments that are derived from animal materials or that contain animal-based inputs in it. Examples would include manure, compost, chicken pellets, fish emulsion, and table waste. Why are we concerned with animal inputs? Well, it's because we know animals can harbor pathogens. So if there are animal components in that soil amendment and it hasn't been treated or managed properly, the untreated soil amendments could be a source of pathogens if applied in our growing areas. So for this reason, the produce safety rule does require that BASAOs are applied, handled, and stored in a manner to prevent contamination. Human waste is prohibited unless it meets the specific EPA treated biosolids regulations. And any untreated raw manure must not be applied to the harvestable portion of the crop. And if you are going to consider using raw manure, FDA has deferred at this time to the USDA NOP guidelines. There are still a lot of benefits of using BASAOs, but it's important to practice your due diligence to ensure it is properly treated to address any pathogens of concern that could be present and to prevent spreading contamination onto your crop. Compost is an example of a really valuable, sustainable, and effective soil amendment, but it's important that if we are going to be using compost, that it undergoes a proper treatment process, monitoring the time, temperature, and turnings if applicable, and particularly if you are going to be making your own compost. The produce safety rule does provide specific time, temperature, and turning parameters that can be met to demonstrate that the compost has been adequately treated. And for your BASAO records, if you do create your own compost, you want to document your treatment parameters, including your time, temperatures, and turnings to ensure that it's meeting the acceptable treatment parameters and include these subpart O requirements. If you receive BASAOs from a reputable third-party supplier, many times they will apply their own treatment processes for their products. For third-party supplied BASAOs, you will need to obtain an annual certificate of conformance or a letter of guarantee from that supplier stating that it has been fully treated and handled in a way that meets federal regulatory requirements. And then during the inspection, you will be asked for those documents if you are using a third-party supplied BASAO. When it comes to animals, whether they're wild or domesticated, you must routinely evaluate risks that can be presented by animals on your property and in adjacent and nearby lands, as well as monitoring for evidence of contamination from animals, for example, fecal matter, crop destruction, or the actual animals themselves if you see them in your orchard or field. The produce safety rule, it doesn't require you to exclude working animals on your farm, but it's important to be aware that even your pets and your working animals defecate too. So they can present risks if they're not properly managed. And then throughout your growing season and before harvest, you want to routinely evaluate if there are any contamination concerns from animals. And if you do see evidence of potential contamination, you want to have a plan prepared on how you're going to handle the produce and the areas that were impacted by those animals. An example of a plan would be if, let's say you see fecal matter in your field. You can address that fecal matter by physically removing it. And then any produce that has fecal matter on it, you can remove that as well. You can consider removing some of the soil and vegetation that was impacted, and then designating a no harvest buffer zone to alert your workers to not harvest any of the produce in that area due to contamination concerns. And then under the produce safety rule, you are technically required to have written records to document your animal monitoring, but it's certainly a great practice to have in place as it demonstrates the actions you're taking and can help you identify trends in animal activity and areas that may have higher animal pressure. If you do have written, for example, pre-season, pre-harvest risk assessments, and animal monitoring records, have these records on hand as your inspector will take a look, and then they can make a note of your proactive animal monitoring and risk assessment practices that you have in place. So now let's talk about equipment, buildings, and tools. Under the produce safety rule, at a minimum, your food contact surfaces or any type of surface that will be directly touching your produce is required to be of adequate design and cleaned and maintained to prevent contamination. Cleaning and sanitizing records must be established for all of your food contact surfaces. So if you don't already have a cleaning and sanitation schedule established yet, you can start the process by first creating a list of all the different tools, equipment, and containers that could directly touch your produce and define these as your food contact surfaces. Then you can start developing your cleaning and sanitation schedules, including the methods that you'll be using to clean and sanitize them, and then creating records to document when your cleaning and sanitation occurrences take place. Your records need to include the method of cleaning and sanitizing that you use, the date and time the cleaning and sanitation occurred, as well as a subpart O requirement. All right, so now let's talk about water under the produce safety rule, particularly agricultural water, which by definition is water that is intended to or is likely to contact or touch your covered produce or food contact surfaces during covered activities. Under the produce safety rule, all agricultural water must be safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. The produce safety rule divides agricultural water into two categories: pre-harvest water, so the water used during the growing phase, including irrigation, crop sprays, and frost protection, for examples. And then harvest and post-harvest water, which is water used during harvesting, packing, and holding activities. This could include washing produce, making ice that will contact produce, water used for cleaning and sanitation, and hand washing water, since our hands are also considered to be food contact surfaces. Last year in May 2024, FDA released updated water requirements for pre-harvest water, which replaced the original mandatory pre-harvest water testing requirements with instead a new written risk assessment that evaluates your entire agricultural water system as a whole, and with various factors that can impact the safety of your water and produce. Because these are new regulations, the compliance dates are going into effect on a rolling basis. So for large farms, which is a farm that makes over $500,000 of average annual produce sales over a 3-year rolling basis, adjusted for inflation, the compliance date has already gone into effect as of April 7th of this year. Small farms, which is a farm that makes over $250,000 and up to $500,000 of average annual produce sales, the compliance date goes into effect next year on April 6, 2026. And for very small farms, which is a farm that makes over $25,000 and up to $250,000 a year, the compliance date will be April 5th, 2027. I do want to note there is a 1-year educational period for farms of all sizes to allow for additional time to adjust to the new requirements. So, for example, a large farm, a formal inspection observation would not necessarily be noted on the new agricultural water assessment portion until beginning April 7th, 2026. However, it's important to note that if there is a significant food safety concern associated with the farm, the educational period would not apply. So while there is a cushion in place to have your new agricultural water assessment buttoned up, you don't want to delay too far on getting familiar with the new requirements. And for harvest and post-harvest agricultural water, all the compliance dates are already in effect for farms of all sizes. And the reason is because there were no changes that really occurred to the original harvest and post-harvest agricultural water rule requirements. The only changes that occurred last year were adjustments to the regulatory code provision numbers due to the reformatting that occurred in the subpart E section of the produce safety rule that's focused on agricultural water. But in general, the overall requirements for harvest and post-harvest water did not change, so all these dates are already in effect. When it comes to the pre-harvest agricultural water requirements, there are a minimum of 2 mandatory records that you must establish and maintain. The first one is going to be your agricultural water system inspection, which is referenced in the blue table on the left. This is an existing requirement that came out in the original 2015 produce safety rule. So this did not change with the new update released last year. What you need to do for an agricultural water system inspection is to, at least on an annual basis and ideally at the beginning of your growing season, is to physically walk through and inspect your water sources and distribution systems and correct any maintenance issues if you see them, for example, major leaks on your wells or damaged well pads. Then you document your findings and determine if the water is safe for its intended use. On the next slide, I'll go over in more detail on the different considerations you must include in your agricultural water system inspection. And then on the green table on the right side, this is the new requirement for pre-harvest agricultural water that replaces that original mandatory pre-harvest water testing requirement. So water testing is now optional for your pre-harvest water under the new regulatory requirements. However, if you are already testing your water because let's say it's a customer requirement or you have to for your third-party audit, you want to continue doing so to not only meet your customer and audit requirements, but there is a lot of value in testing with actual testing of your water. You'll be able to collect valuable quantitative data on your water system to better help inform your decisions. To perform an agricultural water assessment, you are required to evaluate your agricultural water sources and systems, evaluate 5 key factors that could impact the safety of your water and produce, and then apply corrective or mitigation measures if necessary based on the outcome of your assessment. Like the agricultural water system inspection, the agricultural water assessment must be documented and performed annually or whenever a significant change occurs. An example of a significant change would be, let's say you started the season with well water, but something happened to your well where then you had to switch over to surface water. This would be a significant change that would warrant a new agricultural water assessment to be performed because your original inputs no longer apply. There are a few exemptions to performing the new agricultural water assessment, which I will cover in our presentation. However, there is no exemption to the agricultural water system inspection, which is that requirement in the blue on the left. All right, so let's talk about the agricultural water system inspection in a little more detail. So this is where you will conduct a physical walkthrough and inspect your full ag water system, including the source and your distribution system. If you haven't performed one before, a good starting point is to map out your water system to help guide your path of where you'll walk and observe. If you do identify any maintenance issues or hazards, you'll want to go ahead and get those addressed. Also take a look around, make sure your water systems are free of excessive debris, trash, animal nests, and any other potential sources of contamination. And then also consider activities on adjacent and nearby lands and other users of that water that could potentially introduce hazards. As a part of your agricultural water system inspection, you are required to consider and document the following items. So 1, the nature of each ag water source. So are you using ground or well water, surface water, municipal water? 2, what is the extent of your control over each water source? Do you have full control over your water system, or do you have partial control because you're sharing it with other users? 3, what is your degree of protection on each water source? Here you want to describe what you're doing to protect your water source from contamination. 4, you want to consider what is located on adjacent and nearby lands to your farm or operation, and if there are any potential hazards that could be introduced, for example, from animals, other humans, waste, or in-process soil amendments. And then 5, you want to consider what the likelihood of another user introducing hazards onto your water is before it reaches your farm. So that is your agricultural water system inspection that you need to do on an annual basis, ideally at the beginning of your growing season. All right, so now let's talk about the new piece of the regulation on a high level, your pre-harvest agricultural water assessment. You will need to evaluate five factors as a part of this exercise. The first factor is going to be your agricultural water system. You'll see that there's a lot of similarities in this factor with the information you already collected in your agricultural water system inspection. So you'll perform your ag water system inspection first, then take that information collected and feed it into this first factor. You'll want to note down your water source, your type of distribution system. So is the way that you're conveying and storing your water open or closed to the environment? And the degree of protection from possible contamination sources, particularly sources of waste, whether it's from animals, humans, or untreated soil amendments on adjacent and nearby lands. The second factor you'll need to evaluate are your agricultural water practices. So how are you using the water? Is the way that you're applying your water going to have direct contact with your produce, or is there limited contact with your produce? And what is the general time interval of when you last directly applied that water and when you anticipate harvesting your crop? The third is going to be your crop characteristics. So here you're going to list down the types of crops that you're growing that are going to be directly impacted by the water. And if you're aware of any specific risk factors or additional scientific information regarding the crop, including surface adhesion, hazard internalization, or other known food safety incidents associated with the crop, you can include that here. The fourth factor is going to be your environmental conditions. So here you'd want to include information about weather patterns in your areas. For example, are you prone to specific weather events like heavy rains, extreme weather conditions, or flooding? And then this is also where you want to note down patterns of general temperatures over the season and the amount of sun exposure experienced in your area. FDA, they did state that factors 3 and 4 are intentionally being left open to allow the science to grow, but at a minimum, you want to start with these elements listed here. And then lastly, the fifth factor called other relevant factors. This is essentially acts as your catch-all category to capture any additional information that wasn't already captured in the prior 4 factors. So if let's say you are testing your pre-harvest water, this is the factor where you would include your testing data and trends, since it is valuable quantitative information. And then if you also have any additional scientific data that applies to your water system and practices, you can also include those in factor 5. So essentially, the first 4 factors are mandatory to be completed, and the 5th factor will act as your catch-all just in case you have additional supporting information that doesn't fit in the prior 4 categories. So once you evaluate those 5 factors in your agricultural water assessment, you'll have 1 of 4 outcomes with different risk rankings. In this diagram provided by the Produce Safety Alliance, you can see that the highest risk outcome is in the red at the top. And then as you proceed down, the outcome risk levels reduce as you work your way towards the green at the bottom. And then depending on your ag water assessment outcome, you may need to implement either corrective or mitigation measures within a defined time frame appropriate to your outcome. For the sake of time today, we're not going to be able to go into full detail on all the outcomes and corrective or mitigation measures, but I'll share several resources in a few moments where you can take a look into these requirements in more detail. All right, so we talked a lot about pre-harvest agricultural water. Now let's pivot over to harvest and post-harvest agricultural water, which again is water that will come into direct contact with your produce and food contact surfaces during the harvesting, packing, and holding activities. Under the produce safety rule, untreated surface water is not permitted to be used for harvest and post-harvest uses, and it must be verified to be non-detectable for generic E. coli. As you can see already, you can see that the requirements for harvest and post-harvest water are stricter than pre-harvest water. And depending on your water source, there are different requirements. So just like pre-harvest water, you still need to complete an agricultural water system inspection, regardless of the water source that you use for your harvest and post-harvest water uses. If you are using untreated groundwater or well water, you must test that water for generic E. coli and make sure that your test results show there is no detectable generic E. coli found in the water. During the initial year or growing season, you'll want to test your water at least 4 times to establish your initial microbial water quality criterion, and then keep those records on hand for 2 years after the point you no longer use that well. If all of your test records come back non-detectable for generic E. coli, you're good to go, and then you can go ahead and start testing that water once on an annual basis. And then ensuring that all the test results continue to show no detectable generic E. coli. If at any point you do get a positive result for generic E. coli, you'll want to immediately discontinue the use of that water, address the issue that could be causing the positive result, and then test it at least 4 times to demonstrate that your water system is back under your control before resuming that once annual testing frequency. If you're using municipal water, you technically don't need to test your water, but you certainly can if you would like to better understand your water quality at your point of use. And at a minimum, you will want to obtain an annual water quality report or certificate of conformance from your municipality, your city, your county, whoever is providing you that water that demonstrates it is non-detectable for generic E. coli or that it meets the Safe Drinking Water Act regulations. And then you can typically access this information online or reach out to your provider directly to obtain a report. And then if you're treating your water, then you need to make sure that you're monitoring your treatment process. So document what chemical sanitizers that you're using, have the chemical labels on hand to verify it's appropriate for its intended use, and then monitor the sanitizer concentration, pH if you're using a chlorine-based treatment, and temperature and turbidity as applicable. And then I mentioned earlier that there were some exemptions available for the pre-harvest agricultural water assessment. So if your pre-harvest water is meeting the same requirements as your harvest and post-harvest water, and you know the quality is not going to change at your point of use, you would not need to perform a pre-harvest agricultural water assessment because you are already demonstrating that your pre-harvest water is meeting the stricter requirements of harvest and post-harvest water. Keep in mind, though, there is no exemption from performing an agricultural water system inspection, only for the agricultural water assessment. An agricultural water system inspection must be performed for all water sources and systems, whether it's for pre-harvest water or harvest and post-harvest water. If you'd like to learn more about the new pre-harvest agricultural water requirements and do a deeper dive, there are several resources available to assist you. Through CDFA, you can join one of our free PSA grower training courses, request an OFRR, or request free one-on-one technical assistance through a CDFA technical assistance program. You're also welcome to contact us directly by email or phone. We'll be happy to help answer your produce safety questions. And on our CDFA website as well, we also have several blog posts with resources on pre-harvest agricultural water. The Produce Safety Alliance, they've also done a really great job in providing a free on-demand updated Module 5.1 video presentation that goes into detail on the pre-harvest agricultural water rule requirements. And PSA, they also have several record-keeping templates that you can use to complete any of the required records under the Produce Safety Rule, including the agricultural water system inspection and the agricultural water assessment. And then on the FDA website, they also have a webinar that they came out with when they first released the new regulations. They have multiple fact sheets and an ag water assessment builder tool. This tool was created by FDA to walk you through the agricultural water assessment. And if you use this tool, you can input your answers directly in there. And then at the end, you'll get a printout of your final assessment results. It's a really great learning tool. They've embedded a lot of helpful information bubbles along the way, and it's also a great way to ensure you are completing the ag water assessment as FDA intended. So again, there's a lot of great resources available to help you on your journey to compliance, and you're always welcome to reach out to CDFA if you have any questions on the resources or on produce safety anytime. All right, so let's summarize all the record-keeping requirements under the FSMA Produce Safety Rule. So for animals, routine monitoring for animals and animal-related hazards are required, but you aren't technically required to have written records established. However, it's definitely a best practice that we encourage, and that allows you to demonstrate the proactive efforts that you're taking and help to identify trends in your growing operations. During your inspection, you want to be comfortable with explaining to your inspector what types of animals you typically encounter, how you mitigate those animals if you have mitigation measures in place, and if you found, let's say, fecal matter or animal activity in your field or orchard, what steps would you take to address this? For your humans, your workers, you want to make sure you have your worker training records and training materials established and available for review, and have that PSA grower training certificate on hand for your designated supervisor or responsible party. For your biological soil amendments of animal origin or your basals, if you're doing in-house composting, make sure to have your treatment records on hand demonstrating your compost has been adequately treated. Or if you're using basals from a third-party supplier, have a certificate of conformance or letter of guarantee from the supplier stating that it has been adequately treated, handled, and stored in a manner that meets regulatory requirements. A lot of times, if you have a specific store that you're purchasing your soil amendments from, they should be able to provide you those documents or have a way to reach out to the specific manufacturer to help obtain this information for you. And then for water, remember there are two separate requirements for the two categories of water, pre-harvest water and harvest post-harvest water. For your pre-harvest water, you want to complete your agricultural water system inspection and your agricultural water assessment. If you have an exemption from the agricultural water assessment because your pre-harvest water is identical to the quality and requirements of your harvest and post-harvest water, make sure to have your documents on hand to support your exemption. For your harvest and post-harvest water, you'll also want to conduct that agricultural water system inspection. And then for ground or well water, you'll want to test your water for generic E. coli at the frequencies that we previously discussed. And then for municipal water, you want to obtain the certificate of conformance or annual water quality report from your municipality. And then if you're treating your water, make sure to document your water treatment activities and have your chemical sanitizer labels on hand to review during the inspection. And then if at any point you completed a corrective or mitigation measure, you want to document the actions you took as well. For your equipment, tools, and containers, particularly your food contact surfaces, have your cleaning and sanitation records established and describe what you do to clean and sanitize those items. And then if you have any exemptions from the produce safety rule, the previously mentioned records technically won't apply to you. However, you are required to have documentation to demonstrate that the exemption that you're claiming is valid and appropriately applies to your operation. And then please note that during a CDFA farm verification call, you may be asked to provide these records for us to accept the exemption. And then on this slide, you may also notice that some of these records are in bolded red font. This indicates that these records require a supervisor review signature and date. Because these records are so critical, the produce safety rule requires that a supervisor reviews these records on a regular basis, sign and date when they have completed the review, and if there is a discrepancy found with the records, to take the appropriate measures to correct the discrepancy. Okay, so here are the subpart O requirements as promised. So these are the general record keeping formatting requirements that applies to all records under the produce safety rule. So under subpart O, you must include the name and location of your farm on each record. And the reason for this is to ensure that the record actually applies to your specific farm and location, particularly if you have multiple locations associated with your business. And then a lot of times people will have a pre-printed header already established on their record that includes their farm name, farm address, or even have a stamp with their farm name and address that they physically will stamp onto their records. You'll also want to document what you're actually monitoring, not what you wish to monitor or that you plan to monitor in the future. In your records, you only want to write down what you're actually observing. And then if applicable to the record, you can include the produce commodity that the record applies to and the location of the growing area. And a key component of PSR records is to document the date and the time of when the activity occurred. So for example, when the training or when the cleaning and sanitation activity took place. Some records, they do require a supervisor signature review and date, like we mentioned in the previous slide. And for all of your records, you want to make sure that you're keeping them for at least 2 years from the date of creation. During an inspection, the inspector does have the authority to ask you for the last 2 years worth of records, so just keep that in mind. A special call out is for your initial groundwater or well water test results. This is the 4 initial tests you took during the initial year or growing season for generic E. coli. You want to have these records on hand for 2 years after the point when you stop using that well. So don't dispose of these initial test records because you will be asked to provide them during an inspection. All right, so lots of records that we talked about, but you don't need to start from scratch if you are at the beginning of your record keeping journey. The Produce Safety Alliance has record keeping templates already established for each type of record that is required under the produce safety rule that already meets all the regulatory requirements. And you're welcome to use these and add in your own information, or you can use these as a resource to compare against your existing records to ensure that you're covering all the required elements of the PSR. And then lastly, we get a lot of questions about farm labor contractors. So if you do use a farm labor contractor, for example, like a third-party harvester, keep in mind that if they are on your covered farm and performing covered activities on your covered produce, and that produce is still under your legal ownership, you are responsible for ensuring that the produce safety rule requirements are still being met during your growing, harvesting, packing, and holding activities. So it's a good idea to have a conversation with your third-party harvester to ensure that they're, first of all, aware of what the produce safety rule is and that they're meeting the requirements. Because if that produce is legally your responsibility and under your ownership, even if you're outsourcing that labor, it's important that whoever you have contracted to perform that labor on your behalf is not going to cause contamination. Only if that third-party harvester is taking full ownership or legal possession of your produce, let's say you're selling that produce directly to them, would it then become their full responsibility. So just try to keep in mind the ownership chain of that produce when you're trying to determine, who's responsible for what records if you are using a farm labor contractor. If that harvester, if they're just providing labor, they're just providing a service and they're not taking full legal ownership of your produce, then you need to ensure that they are meeting produce safety rule requirements while they're handling your produce. So during an inspection, if we determine that the produce is under your ownership, even if a third-party harvester is physically harvesting and packing it, we will ask for your third-party harvester's training records for their workers handling your crops, cleaning and sanitation records for food contact surfaces used on your crops, as well as the water sources that they use and the applicable water records. An example for water would be if they bring their own portable toilet and hand washing units. You want to verify what the source of that hand washing water is and have the applicable water records required under the produce safety rule on hand. And then this water requirement, it also applies to any third-party portable toilet and hand washing unit providers that you contract as well. All right, so we've reached the end of our presentation. During our session together, we covered what a produce safety rule inspection is, what to expect during the inspection process, and tips on how to prepare for an inspection. Again, you're always welcome to reach out to us at the CDFA Produce Safety Program if you have any questions. We'll be happy to help you over the phone, through email, whichever you prefer. We also have a lot of free, no-cost resources available to help you on your produce safety journey. So feel free to reach out to us anytime, and we're always happy and available to help. And if you'd like to sign up for a mailing list to stay informed on regulatory training and program updates, you're welcome to scan this QR code to register. So thank you for your time. I hope you got some nuggets of wisdom from this presentation. And then with that, I think we'll turn it over for Q&A.
Great.